I am Paul Melmeyer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy here at the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and we're very grateful that you all are joining our latest MDA Advocacy Institute. Today we're going to be focusing on threats to medical research and drug development. We're going to be focusing in on what's been happening at the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration and what is being proposed to happen at the NIH and FDA. Now, before we get to the contents of the evening, let's just do a couple housekeeping items first. So, of course, many of you've joined us for several advocacy institutes now. This is old news for all of you, but just in case we have some new folks joining us, we wanted to point out just a few buttons on your WebEx screen that you can click to engage with us. So first, of course, is the Q&A box on the bottom right. You see those three little dots kind of in the bottom right of your screen over there. If you want to send questions in to myself and our panelists for the evening, please use the Q&A box. That's going to be the best place for us to see those questions. And we'll be taking questions primarily at the end, but we might also be able to take just a handful of questions as we're going about, especially if those questions are clarifying in nature or are right on the nose with what we happen to be talking about in that given moment. So please use the Q&A box. The chat box is also there if you want to, of course, chat with other attendees, but for questions for our panelists, please do use the Q&A box. Now, over on the bottom left side of your screen is that little CC button where you can click for closed captioning. So please feel free to use either. And then additionally, I'll mention that this is being recorded and will be posted to MDA's YouTube channel sometime in the next little bit. So if you're taking notes at home, don't be scribbling too furiously. Know that you can always catch up on anything that you miss that we get to later on once we have posted that on YouTube as well as our advocacy webpage. So let's talk about what we're covering this evening. So welcome. Here we are with our welcome and introductions. Thank you all again for joining us. I'll introduce our two panelists here momentarily. But as for the content and what we're going to be getting to, again, we're going to be focusing in on what we see as threats to medical research and drug development. And starting with the NIH, what's been happening there over the last 5 months or so, and what's being proposed to happen at the National Institutes of Health. We'll then move to the Food and Drug Administration, the agency most responsible for reviewing and approving medical products that we know many in the neuromuscular disease community rely on, what's been happening there and what is being proposed to happen at the FDA. And then we will close the presentation with how you all can get involved. We have a brand new action alert that we're asking for you all to contact your congressperson with to let Congress know that we need a well-funded and well-functioning NIH and FDA. And then, as I mentioned, finally we'll end with questions and answers. So this is who is joining us this evening. We have quite the esteemed panel. I'm so grateful to Kevin and Carter for joining us. As of course on the left side of your screen, there is me. I've said enough about myself at this point. I want to introduce Kevin Brennan. Kevin is the executive director of the NCATS Alliance, which is an alliance of stakeholder organizations, all collectively supporting the National Center of Advancing Translational Sciences. And Kevin is our executive director. But that's just one of his roles. Kevin also is the founding principal of Bluebird Strategies. At Bluebird, Kevin consults with many organizations, including rare disease patient advocacy organizations, including in the neuromuscular disease space. I also know Kevin from his work with the FSHD Society, the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, and more. And Kevin tonight will be lending his expertise on all things NIH. Of course, given his familiarity with NCATS as the executive director of the NCATS Alliance, but then also prior to his work with Bluebird Strategies and with other organizations, Kevin also spent several years up on the Hill working for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro as well as Congressman and Senator Sherrod Brown. So Kevin's wealth of knowledge will be gifted to us here momentarily as we talk about NIH. But before I hand it to Kevin, as we talk NIH-related things, I also want to give a quick introduction to Carter Esham, Dr. Carter Esham, who we're very privileged to have joining us. Dr. Esham is the executive director of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. Alliance for Stronger FDA is similar to the NCATS Alliance, a coalition, a very broad coalition of stakeholder organizations, all united together to advocate for a strong and well-funded Food and Drug Administration. MDA is a member of the Alliance for Stronger FDA, as are tens, if not hundreds, of other groups. Carter, I've lost track of the number of groups in the Alliance, but as many, all united together to try to advocate for a strong FDA. I also know Carter from her time at Bio, where Carter was one of the lead negotiators on user fee agreements and steeply and very deeply involved in all things therapeutic development and regulatory review at the FDA at Bio. And Carter also has experience at many other organizations from there. So as you can see, we have two of our foremost experts in NIH and FDA policy joining us this evening. So before we get into a conversation, starting with Kevin on NIH, I just want to give a little bit of a primer on NIH and what's been happening, just in case this topic is new. Maybe the NIH in general is new to you, and it could be helpful to kind of introduce the role of the NIH within our basic and translational research ecosystem. So the NIH is the primary funder of biomedical research in the United States, and frankly, in the entire world. That chart on the right side of your screen there is from an article in Nature published just a handful of years ago, showing comparatively how much the NIH spends on an annual basis in basic and translational research compared to other entities around the world. And you can see in orders of magnitude, more than just a handful of orders of magnitude, the NIH is spending much more in biomedical research in trying to find new treatments and new cures to accelerate the finding of new treatments and new cures for the neuromuscular disease patient population and many others. You know, as another comparator, MDA, we're very privileged to be able to fund millions of dollars of research every year in neuromuscular disease research. But while we're spending millions of dollars, the NIH is spending upwards of $200 million in basic and translational research in ALS alone. Tens of millions more are spent in muscular dystrophies, in other neuromuscular conditions. And so you can hear just how important the NIH is to the basic and translational research ecosystem. At the NIH, there are 4 institutes and centers that play a particularly important role for our community. The National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, or NINDS, will be the main research entity when it comes to the neuro part of neuromuscular. And then the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, or NIAMS, is particularly important in the muscular aspect of neuromuscular diseases. But NICHD, or the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, is important to research pertaining to pediatric neuromuscular diseases. And the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, NCATS, which you've already heard this evening, is very important in rare disease research holistically, as well as in gene therapy development and other aspects of trying to push the entire field forward for rare disease research. And as I mentioned, hundreds of millions of dollars go to neuromuscular disease research every single year in not just basic and translational research that is happening at outside extramural institutions, but also within the NIH Clinical Center. They are running clinical trials in neuromuscular conditions. There's millions of dollars in funding for training, fellowships for early career and early stage researchers, as well as funding clinical trials outside of the NIH. And as I mentioned, gene therapy development. The list frankly goes on from there. It's very comprehensive what the NIH funds in neuromuscular diseases. Now, what's been happening at the NIH over the last 5 months? I'm just going to introduce some of these topics, and then Kevin and I are going to start a conversation on many of these. But one of the very first things that the NIH announced in this administration was a cap on indirect costs within grants. And we'll get into what those actually are and why they're very important. They sound a bit like a wonky term, but they're incredibly important for research institutions to be able to function. So important, in fact, that you see on the bottom right of your screen a screenshot from the letter that we and nearly 40 other neuromuscular disease groups sent to the NIH asking them to reverse this policy. Now, I say it's attempted because it's actually technically on pause at the moment due to court decisions, but again, Kevin and I will get more into that momentarily. NIH has also been canceling and pausing grants in some specific areas and with some specific institutions. They've been cutting contracts at upwards of 35% of total contracts across the NIH. And that's important because there are a number of contracts that are very important to neuromuscular diseases that have been implicated by this. For example, there was a contract with Harvard University to be the central IRB of the entire rare disease clinical research network that is run by the National Center of Advancing Translational Sciences. That contract was cut. There was a contract that was interrupted for a brain bank in which individuals with ALS were donating their brains to be studied following their passing away. That contract was interrupted by these efforts. And most recently, we've learned of a clinical trial happening within Duchenne muscular dystrophy that was being run by an important institution in the space, but being run in coordination with contractors, and that contract had been canceled as well. So as you can hear, this has real effects on those with neuromuscular diseases. We saw at the beginning of April a substantial reduction in force, so many folks at the NIH being told that they will no longer be working at the NIH. And then there's much more that the administration is proposing to do within their fiscal year 2026 budgets, the budget that supposed to start in October. So you'll hear us talk about the FY26, the fiscal year 26 budget, a number of times because there's a lot of proposals for both the NIH and the FDA within that budget that are very important. So with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing so that as Kevin and I are talking about these different policies and proposals, that you can see us a little bit larger on your screen. So first of all, Kevin, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So let's start with the thing that I started there with that last slide. One of the first things that the NIH announced, which was a cap on indirect costs within grants. So can you tell us what indirect costs are, why they're important in research funding, and what this cap could mean if it was to be implemented for research institutions?
Yeah, sometimes the indirect cost term is known as the facilities and administrative costs, right? So a lot of things that sort of help support the infrastructure of basic research at universities and across the country. So your data privacy, your data management, MRI machines, really significant things that can be shared across an academic medical center and can be used and deployed for other research projects. So it's very broad and incredibly important. I would say that it's one of the unsung heroes of research. And it's what's helped propel the United States in the leadership position that we occupy today as being, the gold standard of the world as far as biomedical research. So the administration, and this isn't even a recent thing, there was an effort a while back to do the same, to cap this at 15%. And they've cited the fact that some private institutions that provide funding at a much smaller scale than the federal government also does 15%. So they make that argument saying, oh, well, if it's good enough for the private sector, it should be good enough for the NIH. The problem is, historically, indirect costs that the NIH has funded that are negotiated between the NIH and the universities that are awarded grants, it averages about 28, 29%. And it's always been kind of recognized that the government's paying more in indirect costs versus others in order to fund these important infrastructure elements that allow us to do clinical trials in rare diseases or things of that nature. So while you can point to that, I think it's a little disingenuous to say, oh, well, we'll just lower it to where the private sector was, as if we're in competition with the private sector. We do things that the private sector doesn't with NIH funding, and it's really important to understand that uniqueness and truthfully not buy into that argument as to why that should make sense. So along with the other cuts that we're going to talk about, a cut to the indirect cost or a cap on the indirect cost would be devastating to rare disease, chronic disease research, and really the preeminence that the United States has in the field of biomedical research and our ability to accelerate and find new treatments and cures. So I think even if you talk to folks in the private sector, I've talked to some of the folks in the rare disease drug development space, and they're really concerned about these cuts because they'll affect their ability to do clinical trials. They provide that basic infrastructure that industry wouldn't know what to do without.
Yeah, indeed. And the bad news is that the administration is very committed to this policy that's also included within their FY26 budget. They very much want to cap indirect costs at 15% instead of negotiating each of the rates for the specific institutions as is currently done. Now, the good news, though, is that the courts have reviewed what the administration has already done and found that the way in which the administration capped indirect costs was not permissible. It was unlawful in the manner in which they did so. And so there was a district court in Massachusetts actually just recently ruled that that is, I believe, being appealed by the federal government to the First Circuit Court. So the case will continue. We'll see what happens. But at the very least for now, that 50% cap is not being applied, but it could still be later on, depending if the administration or Congress chooses to bring it back, which would be very concerning for all of the very pointed reasons you just raised. So let's talk about NIH's cancellation of grants, or canceling or pausing. There's kind of different times in which they'll do one or the other. But there are trends in some of the grants that we've seen canceled, if you will. Can you tell us about what you've been seeing in the kinds of grants that have been canceled by the NIH over the last handful of months, and what our community should know about NIH canceling these grants?
Yeah, I think, if you read the headlines of what's going on or hear some explanation from the administration, you'll hear them say, they're looking to eliminate funding for programs around diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI. They're looking at things that are studying impacts on the LGBTQ community, climate change, vaccine hesitancy. There's a lot of buzzwords that they're flagging. The problem is you might be looking at research that's focused in on the health effects of a neuromuscular disease on underserved African American communities. And then all of a sudden you've lost funding for an important, focus on Duchenne muscular dystrophy or myotonic. And so that's where things are getting wrapped around the axle. They are sort of explaining it in one way, but really what it does is has a sweeping impact, because anything that says that I spoke to one researcher who said his grant got canceled and they couldn't figure out why. They literally did a word search. They looked through all of those buzzwords, and the best they could figure out is one of the researchers listed their hometown as Lebanon, New Hampshire. And so the fact that it remembered, a foreign country, which happens to be the name of the town that this guy lives in New Hampshire, was the only thing they could do. So I think this broad, net that they're casting is really, again, super detrimental to what we're trying to do to advance diseases. And I'll give you a sense. The New York Times did a really smart investigation on some of these grants and what's happening, because I know for a while, Paul and others in this space, we were asking each other, who has a list of canceled grants? Who knows what's happening? And you were having to talk to individual researchers and say, what's happening in your institution? You couldn't get it from up top. So the Times really dug into this. And since the beginning of the new administration, the NIH, they have reported, has canceled 1,386 awards. They've delayed funding for 1,000 additional projects. And this has resulted in a loss of $1.6 billion less than compared to the same, period of time, the previous year. So these are significant, cuts. And, it's not, once you start to lose, your lab, you start to lose some of the trained staff that you have, it's hard to bring those folks back. And so these are, things that could have really lasting, damaging effects on the medical, biomedical research community. And truthfully, in talking to some of the folks that I've worked with in, for instance, the University of Colorado, I'm good friends with an Argentine-born researcher. And he said, look, my wife and I emigrated, after we both got our PhDs because there was a brain drain into the United States. We benefited from NIH being this huge beacon and funder. And he was like, look, I didn't go to Colorado because I love the mountains. I became because I was attracted to the opportunity to pursue what I loved with an NIH grant. And he said, we really run the risk of losing people like me who are going to lose their funding and have to seek opportunities overseas. I think in specifically China, who has a lot more of that money. And that I think is, not only does it affect those of us who care about the neuromuscular community and, finding treatments and cures, but I think it really, it hits me in the core of knowing that the United States for so long has a preeminent funder of research. And I'll just add one last thing, Paul. I think what's really important to understand is NIH has been one of the true bipartisan success stories in this country. For the last 20 or so years, Republicans and Democrats have always agreed that this was important. And I remember Arlen Specter, who was at the time a Republican senator from Pennsylvania, was working with Tom Harkin from Iowa, Democrat, and they made an effort to double funding of the NIH over a 5-year period. And that's been continued. Roy Blunt, from Missouri, who chaired the Labor HHS subcommittee as a Republican, also was really proud of the investments they've made in research. It's only been in the last year post-COVID, partly probably due that we've had this challenging environment. And I hope we can get back to the days of more bipartisan support. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's all very well said, Kevin. It's certainly a different change in tone from what we've been used to and been very grateful for in the bipartisan nature of making sure the NIH is well funded. In addition to the targeted cancellation of grants that seem to be around the issues that you mentioned, DEI, LGBTQI, health equity related issues. And I will mention that actually the courts have been looking at those cancellations, and similar to the 15% indirect cost cap that had been judged to be done illegally, if you will, there are actually judges in Massachusetts just decided similarly about the nature of these grant cancellations, that they were indeed done in an arbitrary and capricious manner. So we're now going to see if the federal government now funds all of these grants. This is very new. It was just over the last couple of days in which these decisions were handed down. They will also be appealed. So perhaps they won't fund the grants in the time in which the case is still being adjudicated. It's making its way through our court system, but nonetheless, we'll see the kind of the end result of the cancellation of these grants. And similarly, I just want to mention briefly before we talk about the reduction in force. In addition to the grants that were canceled based upon these kind of keywords or topics, there are also several institutions that have had their federal funding, by and large, either put on pause or parts of their federal funding put on pause for reasons the administration is alleging that these institutions deserve to have their federal funding put on pause. I don't know if you want to say a word or two about the effects you're seeing at some of the institutions, such as Northwestern or Columbia or Harvard or others, of kind of a more blanket pause on federal funding going to these institutions.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if, the NIH funding for some of these, more premier elite, some of them Ivy League institutions are or more broader. You've seen, stories about Harvard and them not allowing them to, approve visas for international students. There's a sort of a full scale assault on some of these, and I think that we're one part of that as far as the NIH funding, but it's also some of the larger public institutions, in the Midwest or in other parts of the country. So while a lot of the elite institutions are getting the attention, and I think largely the brunt of some of these cuts, it's spread broadly. I remember reading in the beginning of this that the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which is the largest employer in the state of Alabama, was taking significant cuts from that. We have one of our NCATs, part of the CTSA program that does clinical trials work. The University of Utah lost a grant unbeknownst to them. Now, they were successfully able to petition and get that funding restored, which I think, again, is another silver lining to this. I don't want to just project, and I know Paul isn't either, gloom and doom. Like, we're just like, here's all the horrible things that are happening. We're also going to be talking a little bit about how we as a community can make sure we're educating Congress and tying them and telling those personal stories that explain that this isn't just somebody at Harvard and, some storied Ivy, covered building who's doing all sorts of fancy work. This science is helping to deliver, treatments and cures for people who desperately need it. And that's really, the fundamental bottom line that we need to get these members of Congress focused on.
Yeah, indeed. So before we get into kind of looking forward at what's being proposed, let's just very briefly touch the reduction in force that was happened at the NIH and many other institutions. We'll get back to FDA here there in a second. But at the NIH, at the reduction in force, we saw thousands of individuals who were laid off from their jobs. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and the impacts of the reduction in force? Who was laid off and how important were they to the work at the NIH?
Yeah, it was pretty devastating. So at the beginning of the administration and before the Senate had confirmed Dr. Bhattacharya, who's the new head of the NIH, who's formerly from Stanford, you've all probably read and observed some of the conversations around Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, right? There was an effort along with, I think, new Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to do some across the board cuts to achieve some efficiencies, but again, not entirely clear. There's 27 institutes and centers at NIH. There were 1,200 employees who were, terminated immediately. They would show up to the campus, many of them, try to swap their badges to get into the building, and they didn't work anymore. So I don't know that you'd operate a Fortune 500 company and say that this is how you'd rationally run a business, where you would just have people show up and not be there. The number of people, Dr. Bianchi, who was head of child health. So we had, I think, 3 institute directors who were just sent away. we met with one of my clients, with Dr. Bianchi's deputy, and got to see the office that she had. She still hadn't fully packed her boxes to leave, but it was very abrupt and didn't seem very well thought out. And I haven't heard any really great explanations for what's happening. But then you had areas where they would say, well, we've got an IT department and we're going to have efficiencies there. I think that we've seen, again, real permanent damage from some of these cuts. A lot of really good institutional knowledge has been lost. People that really understand, the culture and how to make this place work. So I don't know that we'll fully, have a sense of these impacts until, unfortunately, for a long time. But it's certainly hurt morale. I was up on the campus, and you're not seeing folks who are as joyful about their jobs as they once were, and it's hard.
Yeah, yeah. So we actually have a really good question in the Q&A here, Kevin. I'm going to turn to. This comes from John because it's right on the nose of what we were just talking about. And you kind of answered all this a little bit, but he asks, were these cuts due to Doge? And then let me close out that. And then he says, are they citing waste, fraud, and abuse? Is there a notion that the research is unnecessary or too esoteric?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a lot of there's some pent up frustration, particularly from the president and some others, about how NIH handled COVID, right? And there's concern about masking versus not masking. And there was some inconsistencies in message. It was a horrible time, right? And now there's some questions, there've been questions for a while about, NIH funded research that might have then led to, the lab leak theory in Wuhan, China. And so, and I think these are legitimate questions. Like, I think, again, these can be debated and discussed. But I think that led folks to make not maybe the most rational decisions. And I guess I'd also add, it's really important to remember that Congress has a role to play in this. And I think it's really important. Like, this is my personal opinion. Every institution, whether it be federal, state, public, private, always is in need of periodic and constant reform and looking into. None of them are perfect. There's always chances to make things more efficient or to eliminate some waste. I think that's more appropriately done when you have the stakeholders at the table. So, groups like the Muscular Dystrophy Association and researchers and other public health experts at the table to talk about that. What's the best way to approach this? How can we change the system to make it better? This was done without much daylight, very quickly. And again, without they've had plenty of time to answer these questions, and they haven't. So I think that's really been kind of part of the challenge here. And you sort of assume the worst, given the fact that there's not a whole lot of sunlight here, despite, claims of transparency in this new administration.
That's right. So let's talk about what the administration is proposing to do going forward. And again, this is primarily contained within their fiscal year 2026 budget request, the document that the administration sends to Congress asking for a certain amount of funds to do certain things. And actually within the NIH portion of this document, it's really striking what they are proposing to do. So for one, there's a very substantial reorganization of the NIH that's being proposed. Accompanying that reorganization are a variety of different policy changes on how NIH would operate, including the codification of the 15% indirect cost cap, which we've already mentioned, but also some other ways in which grants will be paid differently. And then finally, a substantial reduction in the NIH budget, a 40% reduction, as I've seen from some estimates in the NIH budget. So what can you tell us about this proposal? What should our community know about what's being proposed and being considered in Congress right now by both the House of Representatives and the Senate?
Yeah, so I'll actually take a step back from fiscal year 2025. So last year, there was an effort in the House of Representatives to start their own consolidation plan. And it was done with Kathy McMorris Rogers, who at the time was the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, and also Chairman Guthrie of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And they looked at, I'm not Guthrie. God, now I'm forgetting at the Appropriations Committee, but it was done through the appropriations process. The challenge with doing it through appropriations is it only has 1 year of standing. Because it's only within that fiscal year window. So the federal fiscal year goes from October 1st to September 30th. So they had put in their report language some changes. So we kind of anticipated that the new administration would want to carry that forward. And so when the budget came out a few weeks ago, the one thing that was kind of surprising is they proposed to reduce, overall funding, as Paul was saying, by 40%, which is an $18 billion reduction. And they also proposed to take the 27 existing institutes and centers and consolidate those into 8. I won't get into which institutes go where because it just gets too wonky and complicated. But again, I think the House of Representatives under Congressman Chairman Cole from Oklahoma, he seems to largely be wanting to track more closely to the Trump administration proposed budget. It remains to be seen whether or not he will also include some language in there in this consolidation. I had talked, and I think, Paul, you might have been in one of these conversations where we'd asked the Republican House staff, and they said it was to be determined. They hadn't decided a few weeks ago if they were going to go down that path. Susan Collins, who's the Republican chair of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, has voiced more concern about some of these changes, particularly the funding reductions. And I don't know that we're going to see them in the Senate bill. So then it's going to be a bit of a tussle between the administration and Congress over their ability to make changes, which I would argue should be done in the statute or through congressional action by amending the law versus the administration taking unilateral actions on this. I suspect that this will get also tied up in the courts. So unclear, but I think it's going to be harder for them to enact this. This is a major policy chain. And again, usually this has been done, trying to do it in a bipartisan way. I don't think that there are any Democrats who, of course, are in the minority in the House and Senate, have any interest in supporting this. This is really more of a partisan, effort. Again, I don't think Democrats are opposed to reforming the NIH. They're just opposed to doing it in the way that it's being done.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of great questions coming into the Q&A as well as the chat box. So we'll be sure to get to those here in just a little bit. But Kevin, my final question for you before we start talking matters of FDA is how can our community, how can the attendees who are joining us this evening play a role in this process? Is Congress and their Congress people in particular, would they be listening to the community, their constituents, when it comes to this appropriations process, when it comes to whether the NIH should have an $18 billion cut and a substantial reorganization within this appropriations bill?
Yeah, this is the fun part of this conversation. Like, you all have so much power to influence this and change the direction. The doom and gloom that Paul and I just talked about, it will become a reality if we are silent. So you're telling your story, describing your personal journey, how important it is and what science has done for you. I think one of the things that discourages me the most is when I hear Secretary Kennedy say that this investment in the NIH over the last 20 years was a waste of time and that we've done nothing to advance, and improve health outcomes for people. I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis when I was 15. I used to see how many ibuprofen I could swallow in a given day before there was a revolution in biologic therapies that were developed by, the pharmaceutical industry that's changed my life. I'd be lobbying in a wheelchair if it weren't for that. And so I think it's really important to describe that we have made real progress, in these efforts, and we need to make more. I also think, to the extent, if there are researchers and clinicians a part of this conversation tonight, partnering with all of us partnering together is the most powerful message that you can send. So sharing your personal story as an individual with a neuromuscular disease or somebody who cares for somebody with one of those diseases, and then a clinician and a researcher, and talking about how all of these connect together, I think is really powerful. And we need to do it over and over again. There's so many messages hitting the Hill. It's really important that we just continue that and find opportunities to, to the extent people are doing town hall meetings, whether they be in person or virtual, visiting their district offices, sending emails, through MDA's website, but really making sure you personalize those, right? Always have a consistent message. Paul and his team help put those together, but you fill in that real authentic message around how this affects you and your state and your community, and keep it up and hold them accountable.
All right, well said. And we'll get more to that action alert here at the end of our conversation. But for now, Kevin, thanks again for the excellent conversation on NIH. We might have some questions here at the end if you're willing to stick around just for a few more minutes.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to hearing Carter's presentation. She'll teach me a lot here.
Exactly, as am I. So I'm going to welcome in Carter just in a second. I'm going to share my screen again so we can introduce our FDA. part of our conversation on the importance of the FDA to our community and what's been happening at the FDA of late. So let me make sure I get my screen up and running, and then we'll bring Carter into the conversation. So the Food and Drug Administration, again, I'm sure is not unfamiliar to most of you, but it approves. It's the regulatory body that reviews and then potentially subsequently approves drugs, biologics, medical devices, a lot of stuff before it can reach the markets. The one pager you can see kind of on the right side of your screen, what I like to point out there is that the FDA actually regulates a fifth and almost a quarter of the entire United States GDP. It's that important when it comes to the scope of its work. And the scope of its work includes reviewing potential therapies for neuromuscular diseases, as well as involving the neuromuscular disease community in that decision making. So what we've been seeing over the last handful of months at the FDA, for one, the FDA also experienced a reduction in force similar to the NIH, which we'll talk about here in a moment. We have new leaders at the FDA, a lot of new leaders at the FDA. Dr. Marty Makary, you see his picture there to the left of the two pictures, is our new commissioner. Dr. Vinay Prasad is our new director of the Center for Biologics. Both individuals have been really active over the last little while, charting a new course for the Food and Drug Administration. And we're likely going to have new leaders at the Center for Drugs as well here shortly, and new leaders of the review divisions as well. So a lot of new faces at the FDA implementing this important mission. New faces and new programs and initiatives as well. And then similar to the FY26 budget for the NIH that the administration submitted, there are also substantial changes in the FDA's budget that the administration is proposing to Congress. So with that, I once again, sorry all for the seasickness I might be causing for the putting the slides on, taking them off. Hopefully it's not too challenging. But Carter Esham, welcome into the conversation. Thank you again so much for joining us this evening. Carter, again, is our Executive Director of the Alliance for Stronger FDA, as well as Principal and Co-Founder of Esham Strategies. So Carter, I want to just start with what we've been seeing at the FDA over the course of the last couple of months. And I want to start actually with the reduction in force that happened in April and your observations on how that reduction in force has affected the FDA and its ability to do its job. So what should we know about the FDA and the reduction in force?
Thank you for that question, Paul. And I apologize earlier. It's like if people saw my head like going back and forth because I was trying to get all my numbers on my screen so I could see them, because there has been a lot going on and I wanted to make sure I was being accurate. So just to take a minute and set the stage for everybody, and I know everybody's probably been following a lot of headlines, but let me see if I can sort of click through the timeline of what has happened and sort of where we are right now. So, as earlier in the year, sort of starting late January, early February, we started to see a lot of executive orders come out of the White House relating to goals about reducing the workforce in the government writ large. And that brought along the DOGE entity, to help execute some of that reduction. And a lot of this was being done prior to the confirmation of the FDA commissioner. And I do think that timeline is important to understand. So as we were trying to track what was actually happening, at one point in time, it was guesstimated that there was about 3,500 staff that were asked to leave the FDA under reduction in workforce, a RIF, if you will, plus an additional 900 that had left the agency under other avenues via executive orders for early retirement, or some just retired. And that number was estimated to be about 900. So that was an estimate of about a 20%, reduction in workforce. Now, as time went on, and once the commissioner was confirmed, Commissioner McCary did state publicly that he was looking at all of those positions and making determinations about which positions need to be reinstated, because technically people that were left under the RIF technically still worked at the FDA. They were just, originally told not to come into the office for a period of time. And so within that window, they actually brought a lot of people back that served critical functions, including in the budget areas, other review supporting functions. Now, fast forward again, we now have a budget that came out of the White House with the commissioner in place, who I think is still fair to say is still analyzing probably a lot of these positions and making determinations about what is actually a position that no longer exists versus a position that is still a vacancy and going to be refilled. But what the budget told us, it did look to sort of solidify that there is a determination that the FDA can function and meet its mission with a reduction in workforce. I would caution everybody to not overly analyze what you may have seen reported out of the budget, which did again put a workforce number down, a decrease of about somewhere between a little over 3,500 to 3,700 reduction in workforce. However, it's the budget you still need to pay attention to. And so that number, that 3,700 number, I think it may be a while before we actually understand what a true reduction in workforce at the FDA is going to look like in the course of the next 1 to 2 years. Because the other thing that's happening that the commissioner has been talking about that is still very much ongoing and not settled is how they are going to do enterprise approaches, what they're saying, where they can look for efficiencies across the FDA, where they think the bulk of this streamlining of reduction of workforce will be found is in looking at enterprise approaches to functions like HR, human resources, IT, some travel and accommodation functions, and some of the communication functions. So that is still, I think, being evaluated and under discussion about how that will work how all those functions will work on a more enterprise level. So it's a long way of saying there is a goal, I think, to have a reduction in workforce. Exactly what that reduction in workforce is still evolving in my own mind. And we, the Alliance, early on did raise concerns about ensuring that it was going to be critically important that the FDA had the resources it needed to manage its workload, to meet its goals, to manage what has been a growing workload. So we have conveyed that message, but again, I think this is still very much an active and ongoing situation.
Yeah, yeah. Well said. Still lots of evolution to see happen with specifically the reduction in force, but just FDA's workforce more generally speaking. We'll get to that in the context of the FY26 budget request here momentarily. But I think something you said I want to go back to and then ask a question from there was that this reduction in force happened prior to the new commissioner officially entering office, if you will, Dr. Marty Makary, as well as, of course, Dr. Prasad as well. But what should we know about the new leadership at the FDA and the new programs and initiatives that they seem to be interested in? How should we get to know them? What should our community know about kind of the new FDA and what they're trying to do?
Sure. So, just a little bit of background on Dr. Makary for those that may not already know, but, he is a surgical oncologist. He was at Johns Hopkins University. He has written several books on health policy, really some of which focus on healthcare costs and how the system and government need to be more transparent as it relates to to health policy, health initiatives. And the CBER director, Prasad, is a hematologist oncologist. And he was at University of California in San Francisco, and also has written a lot of books talking about, I think a lot of his focus was looking at oncology treatments and ensuring that they were still meeting, whether they were still meeting definitions of safe and effective, post-approval and things like that. And I raised that because there has been, I think, a relevant conversation to this community related to accelerated approval. And I'm gonna circle back to that in just a second. So the other interesting thing about the CBER director Prasad is he's also been given 2 additional titles, and that is to be also serve as the agency's chief medical officer and chief science officer. So, and this is all being done in a sense where just recently the current acting director of CDER has left, but Jacqueline Corn-Curry has left, so that is still a vacancy, and they just announced a new deputy director for the Center of Drugs, Michael Davis, who was in the psychiatric division, has been in academia most recently. I'm just trying to find his. I pulled this up a minute ago where he was. He was at USONA Institute, but is now coming back to the FDA to serve as the deputy director. Now, it's a lot of names and a lot of positions that I'm throwing out at everybody, but one thing that we're trying to figure out, there has been a lot of departures in the sort of middle management, and even recently at CBER, to the deputy director of the Office of Therapeutic Products and deputy director have also left. So there's going to be a lot of new people, not just at the top spots, but in those middle spots that are yet to be, they're sort of just now being identified. And I think the other question is, we have seen the commissioner McCary and Prasad going on road shows together. So again, I think they are working together to present a vision for the agency. But again, I think we're still evolving how we'll all understand what Prasad's actual role is in carrying those three positions. I think we're sort of gonna, again, that's an evolving understanding, at least from the outside, externally, as these internal layers are still being backfilled, and identified. In terms of what they've been focusing on, Commissioner McCary's made very clear that he wants to try to deploy tools and methods that streamline process. One of the most recent announcements he's been talking a lot about is how AI can help reduce some of the workload burdens on reviewers, that could help, again, streamline, help maybe people do more work in less time, or just ease the workload burdens, generally speaking. So again, I think that's going to be a big conversation that's going to be continuing to evolve, and something we'll all be tracking very closely. He's made multiple statements about his desires to look at new ways to speed development for rare diseases, including thinking about how you can, if we can apply some of these also technologies like AI, machine learning in the post market, how can we maybe use that and balance what maybe is needed to meet FDA standards pre-approval. Now, where there's been some concerns is what has seemed to be, at least in the press and the media, but even in the commissioner and CBER director Prasad's writings, so maybe different thoughts about accelerated approval. Prasad has been in the past on record raising some concerns about use of accelerated approval in certain cases. But as it always is, what I will remind this audience, once a person takes a new job, they have new responsibilities, and his responsibilities as a CBER director is really he does answer to the commissioner, and I think he has in recent statements made very clear that the FDA embraces the accelerated approval pathway. So again, that's just an important note about where things are today that I think is of import to this community, and that's certainly something I think everyone in the biomedical field believes very strongly, that we all know that the accelerated approval pathway plays a very important role, particularly in novel medicines for rare diseases. So again, I think that's something that everyone will be watching closely as decisions start to unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add a point on that last point there, Carter, it's the accelerated approval pathway that has largely led to the number of Duchenne muscular dystrophy therapeutic options we have in the market now. Several ALS therapies approved via accelerated approval. Accelerated approval could be the key to approving therapies in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and FSHD, and a number of the oftentimes heterogeneous and sometimes slowly progressing neuromuscular conditions in which a surrogate endpoint on a biomarker is relied upon rather than a clinical endpoint. So point very well made on the importance of accelerated approval, and why we're all paying very close attention to that. So before we look ahead towards what is being proposed for the FDA, what is probably most important to those listening in FDA's role is making sure that therapies are being approved in a thorough but expedited manner. So are we seeing any challenges this FDA might be having in thoroughly but quickly considering new and potentially then approving those new therapies under the new leadership after the reduction in force in our new environment?
Yeah. So I would say at this point in time, it's a little early to say. Again, you start to see, I think everybody's seeing anecdotal reports. I think anecdotally, I've probably heard equal numbers of everything's fine to maybe I had a delay, and I don't think I can discern if that's any different than what I would have heard last year at this point in time. But there's a reason for that, right? I mean, we're about 6 months in, but people were still working at the FDA. So again, the reduction in workforce, like when when is a number that hit that we can actually call a reduction in force that we will begin to track, is itself has been a bit fluid. But more importantly, the timelines for drug development, we don't actually know on daily things that are happening, right? With drug applications that are in, there's a meeting that happens and it's 3 months later before another meeting happens. So it may be a while before we see if there are any, and again, I'm not proposing that there absolutely will be, but it may be a minute before we actually can make any statements one way or another. I think the important thing to do at this point is to, as a community, track as closely as we can what everybody's experiences are, what is happening, with the desire to, in the case things start to become delayed, that we can engage in a timely fashion to try to turn that around as quickly as possible, to flag it early, fix it as soon as possible. And again, I think there is the ability, even under the current budget situations, to address some of those issues as they arise, certainly over the course of the next year. So again, going back to, I think what a question is, you'll probably ask me again, but this is always worth repeating. You all as a community, those of you on the phone, this is why advocacy matters, right? This is why, as you all are following medicines and programs that are of import and matter to you, you're tracking those, right? You can be the first people to communicate to members of Congress how things are going. And you are the best people to explain to Congress why it matters, and to the FDA. You are the ones that can deliver that personal stakes message better than anyone. So that is going to be something, again, at this point in time, I'll stand by what I said. It's a little early to tell, and we will see how these new efficiency programs and new organizations, hopefully do streamline, hopefully do work, and they are able to carry out the mission not only as they were, but even better. But this will take, I think, a lot of communication and a lot of tracking to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sure.
For sure, for sure. So my final question for you then, Carter, and you saved me asking the question again on the importance of folks chiming in and telling their Congress people the importance of FDA. But my final question is on what is being proposed for the Food and Drug Administration within the budget the administration has sent to Congress. What should our community know about what's being proposed for the FDA, both in the amount of funding that is being requested, but also any potential programmatic changes and what potential changes could have on drug reviews and therapies reaching our community?
Sure. And so comparatively speaking, certainly to my colleague's presentation on NIH, comparatively speaking, the FDA's budget cuts were not as severe as those that occurred in other agencies. For those that may not know, the FDA has sort of a unique budgetary feature, and that is that some of its dollars come from Congress, congressionally appropriated funds paid for by the taxpayer. But a lot of the funds at the FDA actually come from what are called user fee programs, that are programs that industry pays certain fees for applications and certain fees for product fees that are on the market to support inspections and post-market activities, et cetera. And that goes across the agency. Almost every program has it at some level, but the human food and drug is about 70% of the human drug program is paid for by user fee dollars. So again, I just state that to explain the overall budget. So when you look at the budget document, what you have at the FDA is about an overall 3.8% decrease. So again, comparatively, not as hard as some of the other agencies. It puts it back to about mid to early pandemic levels. I think it goes back to about, I can pull up the exact figures, but it's again comparatively not that hard. But the way that they did it is they did about an 11% increase in the decrease in the congressionally appropriated funds, and they sort of made up for lessening that overall decrease by an increase in user fees, which is actually being driven a lot by inflation rates, to be honest. So for the course of this year, that is what the budget outlook looks like. Of note, the user fee negotiations are beginning again. So they all sort of run on about most of them run on 5-year cycles that have to be ratified by Congress in 2027. But the technical negotiations between industry and the FDA that sort of negotiate that fee level and what performance goals they will get for that fee level, aka how many months should it take for a drug to be approved, how many months should it take to um, get a meeting request accepted and implemented, etc. Those start to begin later this year. So one thing that I will note for all of us over the course of the next year that we'll all be following is those user fee levels, because we have heard from the commissioner and others some concerns about the level of the user fee dollars and whether that is something they want to look at in terms of I think the question is it too much industry influence? Is it a problem or not? So again, I don't, not saying anything's going to change. I'm not saying anything's going one way or another, but I think when you hear those statements, it's just something we all want to watch. We'll be looking out for over the course of the user fees and how that may impact how we have to think about congressionally appropriated dollars. Because again, I think, if one goes down, we're going to have to make it up in the other direction. So.
Right, right. Yeah, indeed. All right, well, very good. That was very comprehensive. Thank you, Carter. I'm just going to put one more slide up here as we've all referenced it, and this is the ability to reach out to Congress and mention the importance of these programs. And Mark already put in the chats the link to our action alert that we've crafted just for you this evening, asking for Congress to prioritize funding, robust funding for the NIH and the FDA to agencies, to institutions that are incredibly important towards getting safe and effective new therapies to our community more quickly than they're already coming. It's a sample letter. It's already written in kind of its general points, but to Kevin's point from earlier, and Carter, you as well, please do personalize this with your story on the importance of biomedical research on new treatments for the condition that you live with, or your loved one, or your friend, or if you're a medical provider or a researcher, the importance of these programs as well. So please customize it and share it as well. If you know folks in the community who support the NIH and the FDA, share that to them as well, so we can get as many voices contacting Congress on these important issues as we possibly can. So with that, I realize we only have a minute or two left in our hour. You can always reach out to us at advocacy@mdausa.org to email us with any questions, as well as contacting our resource center or going to our webpage at mda.org/advocacy. But with the minute or two we have remaining, I'm going to check the Q&A box as well as the chat box to see what we have here as a question. There was a great question from Shelley, which I'm going to start with and answering, but then Kevin and Carter, if you want to chime in with anything from there. Kevin, this is mostly within your area, but this was prompted by your mention of researchers potentially going to other countries, other jurisdictions, if you will, to pursue opportunities there. And Shelley's asking, do we know what the interest level is in China for the study of neuromuscular diseases? And are American researchers willing to follow the money? How difficult will it be for them to do so? Well, I'll just start by saying that many of the foremost researchers in neuromuscular diseases in the U.S. right now are not originally American. They followed the money here. They're German, they're Australian, they're Argentinian, they're Chinese, they're Indian. They came from other places to do their research here and continue to do their research here. And if their funding is jeopardized, they, as well as perhaps American-born researchers, may indeed follow the money to go elsewhere. I don't know off the top of my head specifically China's interest in neuromuscular diseases. That will be something we'll be taking a look at potentially if this does become more of a reality. But it is a great concern that we could have that brain drain of some of America's very best going to other countries to research the neuromuscular diseases instead of doing that here in the U.S. Kevin, anything you'd want to add to that? To that answer?
No, I mean, I don't think we're going to fully know, right? I think there's a ripple effect of some of these cuts. And so researchers who are personally affected aren't racing out the door. I think it's a little speculative, but not without some basis in fact. I mean, China has a great deal of budget China is working hard to develop a very robust life sciences sector to compete with the United States. And I think this is an opportunity for them to attract folks in. They certainly have, I think, more money to spend on research than, say, Europe or Australia or other places. So I think they could be a dominant player if they so choose. I was with a CEO of a digital health company the other day, and he looked at me and he said, if this continues, the cure for Alzheimer's disease will come from China. Like, it really just sort of hit me, upside the head when you're like, wow, this really could be a huge shift generationally that could send all of this talent and science over to one of our biggest strategic competitors. And it's troubling. So, I hope you guys can help us reverse that and maintain our preeminence in this space and keep these researchers here doing the great work that they're doing to help advance, health outcomes for folks with neuromuscular diseases.
Yeah, well said. Since we're already 2 minutes over, I'm just going to take one more final question from the Q&A here, which was on the grants that had been canceled and if a judge had ordered NIH to reinstate them. This comes from Hank. Yes, there were actually two cases that resulted in two different judges in Massachusetts telling NIH they had to reinstate these grants, but they're only about a week old, so we're still not sure exactly how that's going to happen, if it's going to happen, if the administration is going to find other ways to prevent that from happening. Hopefully, of course, these grants are reinstated, but we will still have to see. So, Hank, you're staying up in the news, and I appreciate that, but we're still going to have to see if those grants are indeed paid out to these institutions and these universities. So with that, I apologize that we don't have more time for questions today. We had so much content to get through. But I, again, want to extend my gratitude to Kevin and Carter for joining us this evening and talking with our community on the importance of the NIH and the FDA and the importance of our community reaching out to Congress on the importance of the NIH and the FDA. Please do, again, follow that link in the chat there to contact your congresspersons about NIH and FDA funding. And with that, we'll wish you all a very good rest of your evening. Thanks all.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye-bye.